All right, guys, welcome to another episode of The Conscious Endeavor. We're here talking about the self, reality, consciousness, all the good stuff. I'm joined here today by Mr. Robb Duncan of he sits on the board for the McKenna Institute. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Nice to be here.
Yeah, yeah. So you are currently in Dolcezza, right?
Dolcet's are
Dolcezza.
very good. Yeah,
Right,
that's
cool.
good
So
for the first
gelato, all the
first
crazy
time.
things that you're a bit of a person of many hats, many trades. So you work with the McKenna Institute, as many people know, Terrence McKenna and Dennis McKenna. You and I had met in Manhattan at an event where he was present, he was speaking. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what the McKenna Institute is and what you guys focus on there?
So it's the McKenna.Academy.
Hmm.
It's how technically the Academy of Natural Philosophy. So Dennis founded this years ago. I think like 4 or 5 years ago, and then with pre-pandemic, and with the intent of the business model of doing retreats. I think that's kind of a typical business model for how people run it, and to set up different centers, and specifically down in Peru, I think in the Sacred Valley, where he had some retreats with ayahuasca, with psilocybin, and different speakers that would come in.
Hmm.
And then the pandemic showed up, and really overnight changed that business model. And this was all before I came into the academy as a board member, and I'm the treasurer as well. And so they went kind of pivoted online and did fireside chats and did different talks and brought in guests and kind of this kind of stuff right here.
Cool.
And then they had the ESPD 55. And I mean, there was an ESPD 50, but I think ESPD 55, which was 5 years later, obviously in England, that's when things kind of came together. And it was kind of round two, chapter two
Cool.
for the McKenna Academy as far as where we're going with it now, and some of the projects. So
Cool. So the
it's in its
ESPD2 is
infancy
a
still.
conference that you guys went to?
So if I get it right, ESPD is Ethnopharmacological Search for Psychedelic Drugs,
Hmm.
and it was a U.S. government conference that Dennis is much better with the details. It was a conference that I think was in San Francisco in 1968.
Mm.
I could be off on the years; it could be 70. Um, and that was right before the war on drugs. Everything kind of got shut down, and there was a book that was published from that conference. I think that Dennis came upon when he was in his teenage years and was just blown away by it, as far as all the drawings of the plants, the uses, very encyclopedic. And he had been interested, obsessed with it since he was
Hmm.
young. And so then he had this conference, ESPD 50, in the 50-year anniversary of the original U.S. government conference held in some
Wow.
castle in England.
Right.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
got I got those hardcover books. I was fascinated by it. Just beautiful books, two volumes.
Right. Yeah. So let's.
And Donna Torres was the illustrator
Hmm.
on that. Who was like Manuel Torres.
Hmm.
It's his wife, and she's just an amazing illustrator of different plants and stuff.
Wow.
So
Yeah. So just to break it down a little bit too. So you were working with, or familiar with, obviously Dennis McKenna and Terrence McKenna, and they pushed a lot of, I think it was the early 2000s, the 90s, when they started to push the idea of the use of, psilocybin and mushrooms in, a healing space, really as a pharmacological agent. And it's one thing that's very interesting about it is, the psychology community really starting now to emphasize the use of these things and really get clinical trials and, have them be, some of the most potent and powerful things that really change behavior, that change people's, thinking and mindsets. There are now neuro studies on these things. But yeah, really amazing how, getting integrated into that and you were very close with the community. So really, really interesting. How did you come to meet maybe, originally, Terrence and Dennis and where did that story take you?
I'll take you on a total totally do storytelling because it is a journey. So, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. I was just grew up latchkey kid, kind of wild child in the woods, roaming, building fires, forts, all this kind of stuff,
Woodsy stuff.
and woodsy stuff. But also in Georgia, right? So
Hmm.
very traditional, very conservative, and my family particularly very very religious. So I kind of grew up in that milieu, that environment. And I mean, other than being the rebellious kid and stuff, um, I hadn't gone yet too deep in, I guess, the beliefs that were constructed, that were laid in place from early years, until really in high school and then into college. Started smoking really good cannabis, and then going and doing acid and mushrooms. And at first, I think it was all in the nature of just get smashed, just get fucked up. I mean, that was like where it all began. But then inside of those experiences, particularly my brother and myself, and I actually remember
Hmm.
where it started in our backyard in the sandbox with a fire at like 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, tripping on acid, and we just started those like just staring into the fire and this feeling of this is the same fire that's been looked at for millennia, for
Wow.
hundreds of thousands of years, as far as people looking into
Right.
fires.
An
And
ancestral
um,
energy.
yeah, yeah, and the warmth and light and cooking and all that. um, and that was something, that was the first time I think that the light went on where we felt that there was something more to this. And so
Right.
from that began a lot of experiments of going into the mountains in the Smoky National Park with hits of acid, going up to the top with mushrooms, and having each our own dosage, our pre-rolled fatties, and kind of going off and
Mhm.
tripping
Yeah, I mean,
overnight
with flame
in our
too.
own.
Yeah. It's very interesting with
Yeah,
the fire, the Native Americans, they say how you build a fire is how you live your life, right? So how do you
yeah.
maintain it, right? How do you build it? Where do how do you feed it, right? All these sorts of things. It's very interesting. I mean, coming into that space with especially the use of psychedelics as well, you see that Native peoples have always had a shamanic practice, have had, a kind of way of tapping into deeper states of the self. They have Sundance, those things where they don't eat, right? They fast for a period, I think it's a couple days potentially, and then they just dance for days and days and days and continue moving. So there's always that exploration, and there is a really interesting aspect of like the roots of like who we are, the roots of this species, that some of these psychedelic plants bring people to, deeper levels of themselves. And you mentioned that conservative nature too, like, where you grew up, where you came from, and what really, sets the precedence for us as people, as our identity, what our behaviors become, and all these sorts of things are so much driven by the culture that psychedelics kind of serve as that, kicking off point to be like, oh, okay, well, what does the biology, have to say about this at a deeper level? It becomes really quite interesting, so that was your foray into getting introduced to these plants, these topics, and then did you eventually kind of find a tribe of people that you worked with, or at what point did it maybe become more ceremonial for you?
Well, then that's kind of from that backyard fires, when for my brother and I, it became more ceremonial. Previous, it wasn't at all, and
Right.
that's when would go up into the mountains. We would each have our separate doses. We would go off and we would have the experience that night, and then at a campfire in the morning, we would gather and kind of talk about what each one experienced. And so
Yeah.
through all of that, it was really the first time that I was ever pulled outside of my cultural values and saw it from the outside to question it. And so within that, I started reading a lot of stuff. And one of the things that I saw, and I got high times every month. We grew in the woods in our backyard and in friends' houses and everything. And inside of the high times, there was a book review on true hallucinations by Terrence McKenna.
Wow.
And just the book review pulled me in. I purchased the book, and I could not believe what I read, and I've read that book probably
Yeah.
8 times to this day. And I would sit at Georgia Tech, with my friends, and I would read chapters out of it, like sitting on the sofa, just because I could not
Wow.
believe the accounts and the stories that Dennis and Terrence were telling from what happened to them down in the Amazon in the early '70s in La Chorrera,
Hmm. Yeah.
in the Colombian Amazon. And that's what introduced me to Terrence and Dennis McKenna.
Right.
And then I went deeper and started reading all about Richard Evan Schultes, who was kind of the father of ethnobotany at Harvard University, and all the different essays, and Jeremy Narby, and all these anthropologists and kind of scientific looks into psychedelics, because obviously that what we come from in the West, and here especially in America, the founder and the exporter of the war on drugs with Nixon, and after that with the whole Just Say No with Reagan,
Yeah. Big
is
cultural war.
our yeah, that talk about cultural imprints.
Hmm.
We have a very particular and very extreme one on the use of any kind of substance. Well, I guess any kind that's not alcohol, tobacco, sugar, the
Caffeine.
ones that are caffeine, right?
Yeah,
The
the
ones that
approved.
are approved by
Or also make you more
Western
productive,
culture.
allegedly. I mean, at least with caffeine, nicotine, these substances, are things that are kind of pushing you along the productive path, right? Rather than ones that,
Yeah,
one of the things, I think it's a Terrence McKenna quote, but he talks about how, these substances, psychedelics, they absolve your idea of authority, that we have authority in hierarchical structures in society. And we're all kind of on this top down, you know, plateau of like, social order and societal order. And, we have these ideas of, even in the psychology too, something that, if you don't have a lot of, let's say, self-confidence, for an example, you can very easily fall into these systems of assimilation and of, bereavement, and kind of like just getting into, lesser states where you're susceptible to, capital manipulation and the job market, and going to kind of creating yourself based off of what is, existent, rather than creating a culture and creating your experience, your existence out of, something more natural, right? So really interesting that these things, make you question that. They make you question, where do we come from? What is the point of this? Why do we, have these specific behaviors? And it's seen in the science too. Um, some of the neuro stuff about it too, with, specifically psilocybin, activates an area of the brain called the anterior cingulate, anterior cingulate cortex, right? So that part of the brain is involved in reward, right? So how often are we always following this kind of pleasure, pain, and avoiding pain, kind of significance, where, okay, well, I followed this route because I was just seeking reward. In school, you're looking for the gold star. In high school, you're looking for the good grades to get into college. In college, you're getting the big degree to get the good job. We're constantly externalizing, these kind of systems of reward, where these, as they now call them, Alex Gray was present at that event we were at as well, and he would call, entheogens, right? These substances we call entheogens, which was about finding the God inside, and getting into that deeper level of self. It's like, okay, well, now if I'm God, do I want to work 9 to 5, right? When you realize the God self, you think about, okay, well, why am I doing the behaviors that I'm doing? And how have I come to this, kind of place? And I mean, it's really radical in terms of behavior change and things like that. I don't know if you want to comment on that a little bit, like in terms of, the psychological or the spiritual
oh
aspects
yeah,
of
have
how that hit
lots.
you.
I'll go back to the very beginning. What you
Yeah.
said as far as something I think that Terrence coined was psychedelics dissolve boundaries, and that is like, I mean, that is so true, that when you are in a psychedelic state under the influence of psilocybin, ayahuasca, LSD, even MDMA, which technically is not a psychedelic, but still,
Hmm.
it pushes up against your own boundaries, as far as boundaries of everything that any ideology, any concepts, any linguistically held beliefs.
Right.
And that's, I think that's also kind of the part of the experience that is kind of the difficult, if there is, there is definitely a difficult phase of the psychedelic experience, which
Yeah.
really,
But
you have to surrender to be able to really just let go to the whole experience, which I think for all of us that we have egos, every one of us, the ego, by its very nature, never ever wants to give up control. It's the resistance that's just
Right.
built in, right? And so there is a part of that resistance that one has to go through, and it helps in understanding what of the substance, of the traditions, of the experience, just so you can have your techniques of meditation, of breathing, of relaxation, to really let the experience unfold. It's kind of like you puncture a membrane and you're ushered into another space
Mm.
that truly does let you see things, self, other, reality, from outside of language, from outside of belief structures, and like you were saying before, any power structure, any power hierarchy does not like that, because the whole notion of rule is you have to have a group of people, a large body of people, a country, a village, whatever it is, a city that subscribes to certain beliefs, and so you can kind of you can go about your day, and you can have
Right.
order. And I think and I know that the power structures, that's the last thing that they want us to be, is each one turned on, tuned in to who they are truly, to the divine inside,
Mm.
to to whatever that means. I think it's different for each one of us, just because that's harder to rule, that's harder to control, that's harder to sell a product to, that's harder to sell a political ideology, a
Right.
religious ideology to. And and it's really funny, as far as we go back into our myths, and one of the most powerful stories that we have for all of us on the West is the Garden of Eden. And again, it's something I think that Terrence said. He said so many things so eloquently, just being the Irish bard that he was, as far as saying that the Garden of Eden was history's first drug bust. Um, in the sense that you
Don't
think
eat that
about
apple.
Eve.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like,
Right.
Eve pulls the fruit off the tree of knowledge,
Hmm.
turns on Adam, and they weren't supposed to partake from that because they would see as the gods would see. And right when they did that, Yahweh pulls up in a squad car, kicks them out of the garden, and they feel shame for the
Right.
first time. And
Exile.
it's like I feel like those are so significant, at least in my own uncoverings and explorations through my own psychology that was laid in place from my early infant years, that I have been able to access and navigate throughout the last 3 decades of my life, through these psychedelic experiences,
Hmm.
of going back and seeing these things in place, where it's really, the trick is, it goes back even further to original sin. Once you allow the external authority over yourself, then you're game for anything after that.
Hmm.
And I think along the way, certain people in power understood that.
Yeah.
And once you can give away your own conviction to the external authority, then you're rulable. And so it's like, there is no, I think in modern day, it's very hard or near impossible to find where you're cultivated and trained and taught and educated in this whole thing of finding out who you really are, especially
Yeah.
in the West, right? I mean,
Minus
and
the
because it's got,
minus the
well, I mean,
McKenna Academy, of course.
well, yeah, of course, you have to find
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
circles, which I think
Right.
nowadays is much easier to find your
Yeah.
circles than back in the day, before the internet, before
Hmm.
electronic technology.
Yeah. It took
You
me
can
some time
connect
as
with the
well.
others.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely finding people, in a sense, even who are spiritually open, open to questioning, just the general nature of things. I think building and having curiosity is one of the most important things we can do as humans. So even the tenet of science in and of itself is about being non-biased. But we ironically find a lot of bias towards certain, especially in this regard, towards psychedelics, towards substances that are, culturally or, legally looked on as something that, should be allowed. But these are some of the most, insanely effective and relevant substances on the planet. You mentioned MDMA as well, and that's being used for PTSD, for people who have trouble talking about particular traumas. You chemically elevate their mood state for a period of time, and then they're able to kind of speak through and talk through traumas and actually get through, sessions of talk therapy using, again, these substances. So something really interesting is how, how and where the fact of this, came in, because a lot of times it's under the guise of, well, we're trying to protect you, it's public safety, and et cetera, et cetera. But they're much deeper revelations, and it's that freedom of wanting. I think there's that Bill Hicks quote that says it's not a want of drugs, it's a want of personal freedom, right? And this idea, that people want to explore their consciousness. And in the West, how limited we really allow our conscious states to be is mind-boggling. Again, this idea of like, we should question what we do because that's how we get better, in the tenet of science and the tenet of this thing. Question this. Why does this work this way? Why does this operate this way? Why does society, as sociology, the individual, there's so many revelations that come about with psychedelics in general. It's really wild.
Yeah. I really feel like that particular MDMA being in the studies with MAPS and particularly the war vets who have. Sorry about that. That's my partner here. Dime. Soy acá en entrevista. Oh. No, por favor. I'm sorry about that. So the what they found in these Iraqi war vets is that if you're in the war, just say your mate gets his head blown off right
Mm-hmm.
next to you, right? You come back into society, and it's impossible for you to integrate because you have that there. What they're
Right.
finding is these vets who come back come with PTSD, that in after 2 sessions, 60% of these vets are being cured of PTSD. Where 12 months later, after the study, they'll go back and they will not have the strong PTSD symptoms. And what they're saying is, it's really interesting to hear all this stuff broken down into scientific language, which, back in the day, there was like just suspicion just from
Right.
one's own
Yeah.
experience. Where now it's amazing to hear the language of science speaking about it, which I think is very important,
Yeah.
because that's the language that we all speak here in the West. And if science says it and CNN comes on and says it, then everybody will believe it. But for better and for worse, um, but it's allowing them to go into this experience, in this case, MDMA, and for that brief moment of time, 2 to 3 hour of the experience, they are able to get outside of that emotional state that's held in place 24/7 by that trauma. And by them
Yeah.
getting outside of that state emotionally and no longer feeling inside of that trauma, so they can still see the trauma, but from a distance, from a space, which
Right.
in that sense is very Buddhist, that's what they're then calling this whole the plasticity of the brain, the rewiring of the brain, and the default mode network, which is something that's coined in
Right.
the last 2 years, I suppose, that it's laid in place, the memories create neural connections, and somehow, some way, when you go under the influence of MDMA or psilocybin or ayahuasca or LSD, that is suspended. It's kind of this part of the brain that holds the default mode network under scans goes dark, and it's the
Mm.
neocortex that is then lit up under these scans, and it's allowing new neural network connections to be created,
Right.
and that's what's healing people. So it's really, it is, for the first time ever in the next couple of years, true tools will come in to our hands to be able to use to understand the self, to better understand the self, to better understand the mind, how that relates to reality. And it's like, there's nothing more that we need right now than that,
Mm-hmm.
than these tools to help understand what is it that we're doing?
Yeah.
Why is the world a mess? Why are we have so many wars, famine? Why do we hate each other for each different ideology? Where it's such a it's all a decision. It's an
Yeah.
act of will, for us to actually enjoy our short time here on this planet all together. It's
Right.
just a matter of will.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, also commenting a little bit on that default mode network, we talked about that actually in a previous episode with someone who was a breathwork practitioner, and they had mentioned there was a couple studies as well, derailing these networks, right? So again, for people who aren't familiar, the default mode network is just these particular areas of the brain that are online when your brain is, at idle. right? So normally when we're at idle, we have these spaces of, thinking. There's a part of your brain called the precuneus, which actually deals with autobiographical memory, right? So you're thinking about things that pertain to you, to yourself, to the progression of your day, obviously the perception of time. And then the frontal lobe comes online in rationale, reasoning, trying to now, okay, like order this, and how do I look at myself, and in terms of, my past, my future, these projections, right? Which is kind of like, what we do in the everyday. We're always stuck. This is also, part of the reason why people tout for psychedelics, is because they get you out of that everyday thought space. They get you out of the space of, you know, one of the things, it's like, I feel like you stop asking what you like, who you are, but you start asking what you are, on a fundamental level. What is this phenomenon? What is this experience that we're all collectively having, 100%. And it is interesting, as you mentioned, the fact that science is weighing in on these things. A lot of people do need that kind of intellectual justification to go into these altered states. Again, our ego, as you mentioned too, is very in control and very like, this is the way life is. And if anything, goes against that, we have, what we call in psychology the confirmation bias. So it's going against what we already know. It's unfamiliar, right? So a lot of times the ego is going to just try to shut all that down. Right. But with these psychedelics, especially LSD, what the science is showing too, is that hyperconnectivity between the brain. And this is why people have those kind of synesthetic experiences, right? Where they see sounds and they can hear colors, and everything kind of blends together, because all the brain is basically essentially, hyper communicating. And areas of the brain that don't normally talk to each other are, now in hyper connectivity. So they're sharing information at rapid rates. And it really is interesting how that kind of leads into, I mean, it's really like a form of higher cognition, of higher, because again, we're creating, we always talk about in psychology, like creating new pathways in the brain, right? You want to have a new behavior, you want to create a new habit, right? All those sorts of things. Let's create new connections, right? But one way to literally just de-inhibit all the neural networks that exist and have the brain communicate at large with itself, within itself, because LSD, psilocybin, these chemicals activate serotonin receptors, and they're just literally, activating these, serotonin receptors, and allowing for communication across multimodal networks, and things that we just really haven't even scratched the surface of, I feel. Um, but
Agreed. The thing that I see over and over and over is through these different tools, through all the ones that we've already mentioned before, what it seems to give is a better view of reality. And just in the sense of, it doesn't actually do anything, it just removes all the obscuration. And it's like that membrane, all the lenses, all the prejudices, all the
right.
judgments, all the ideologies, all concepts. It just removes all of that, and you kind of behold reality and the self a little more accurately than you had before you went into this. And so that, to me, that's everything, because that's getting down to the foundation. Because I really feel that how many ever of us are on the planet, 8 billion people, we all want the same thing. We all
Mm,
really just want love, to be loved, to love, to have the security of family.
100%.
And really, anything outside of that is just, it's details. Um, but you don't really get that sensation, right? That's kind of like what everybody wants in the world, just because of all the agendas and business and all the different for profit motives and all this. And so the thing is, if we were all able to see things for what they really are, then a lot of the problems on their own indirectly would fall away. And
Hmm.
that's what I really feel. I think there's a tsunami that's coming, a revolution that's coming in mental health, in human
Yeah.
evolution right now, with the fact that these are 2 years or less than 2 years away from becoming legal, and where you can go into your psychotherapist and have a session under one of these substances, under one of these plants, and get true for the first time in my life, I think for the first time in probably thousands of years before this stuff started to be covered up, is to actually get in touch with the self.
Mm.
that's the most important thing. And it seems like, that's what, like, there's been so many obstacles for just that. It's like you now,
Yeah.
especially in the West, all we really are is consumers. And there's a lot of momentum, there's a lot of energy, and just to get us to consume. And the best consumer is an uneducated consumer, the one that doesn't push back, and that just, you see a commercial and you buy, or you hear
Right.
a political campaign slogan and you vote. But
Right. A
it's like
lot of
if
them
we can
working
get
on
in touch with ourselves,
familiarity.
yeah, yeah. So it's just I really feel what's around the corner. Not even the ones that are inside of the movement can fully fathom what's coming very soon for us.
Mhm.
And it seems like just in the nick of time. I mean, it's like the mental health crisis and the talk of climate change and all the kind of the flux in the system right
Yeah.
now. It's like if we could just get in touch with more of who we are and be a little more aware of what we do. That's radical right there, and it's as
Hmm.
simple as it gets.
Yeah, I mean, the societal change is something that can be, extremely just huge. If people do endeavor into these substances, they naturally, get people to, I think, look at life on a more basic level sometimes too. You see the symbolism behind routines that you're doing. Simple living is one of those things that um, was something that we came from, I guess, in our ancestral past. You know what I mean? In terms of, we're hunter gatherers, we live with the land. And one of the big things I think in terms of what we're doing in terms of, you mentioned consumerism, corporate, entities in this sense, is we're very detached from our true essence, our true biology, right? I mean, we have capacity and we are, exercising to some degree our intellectual ability. We are able to, build things, form concrete, refine metals, make buildings, but at the end of the day, not many people really want to sit in that building all day. You know what I mean? It's a marvel, right? Of course. But at the same time, these things are, people are sitting in office buildings, messing up their posture and sitting under fluorescent lights, which are not good for you. You're losing vitamin D. You're not getting the benefits to your skin. There's all sorts of metabolic processes, the lack of fresh air, you know what I mean? Like that are just, we're constantly living in this manner. I think to some degree the European countries are a little bit ahead of us here in America just because they have, I think, I don't remember if it was Denmark or there's one country that recently just mandated a 4-day work week. Having an appropriate work-life balance is definitely something that the Europeans do better than us. But where our habits sit and where our patterns sit are incredibly important, just to understanding ourselves in that deep rooted nature. There are, with Terrence McKenna talks about the stoned ape theory, this idea that
Yeah,
we were at one point, because I think it's about 2 million years ago where we had that boom in evolution where the human brain went from, one size, just grew tremendously, to the point where as a species now we have the largest brain against our body size, right? So, some of these substances catalyze these things, and all of a sudden, maybe that's where language came from. Maybe that's where, some of our abstract concepts come from. Because a lot of, we talked about linguistic practices or linguistics and how it locks us into particular, mindsets. For example, people really can have a very strongly fixed mindset in terms of the language they use, the attributes that they give to the judgments they make, right? All sorts of things. And again, psychedelics absolving this, standard structure, right? The default, right? Getting away from the default is incredibly important, but society in a general is really going to be revolutionized if we all come to that. And not to say that these, because there are deeper states as well that are, meditation is breath work, as we mentioned, that facilitate us into, again, coming out of that ego state, right? Coming out of competition, moving towards, cooperative kind of practices, that's really what's going to push us towards, I think, push us over the edge if we learn to cooperate again. Because so much of what we see in the West is dog eat dog capitalism and, this and that. But
No, believe me,
communal
being in
living.
this world of like business and the consumer packaged good industry, you see that
Hmm.
all the time as far as just the way, you know, business by its very nature is such a dog eat dog world, and
Yeah,
that's the one the badder you are, the bigger you get, and the more rewarded that you are, and it's
right.
very interesting to move in that world and to see how the rules are, and then to try to find your own path through that. I mean, that's just like every day of every life, no matter where we go.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah,
And that's
because
where I think that getting turned on, and you mentioned meditation and yoga. And a lot of times when I talk to people about psychedelics and stuff like that, almost the default response or answer is like, "Oh yeah, I don't do that. I prefer meditation, yoga." And the one, and I've always noticed that within people. But what I've really discovered over like 30 years, with there was like a 20-year pause of deep psychedelic search in there, in the time of like having kids and growing a business, just because the needs were very like linear. Clarity was needed to do all that. But now really coming back after time to the psychedelic space, the one thing I see is the meditation specifically, and the connection to breath is one of the most important, if not the most important tool in psychedelic navigation, of just always returning back to the breath as one releases from the matrix of the self, which are just linguistically held ideas. They're not
right.
real. That's the
Yeah.
thing that's just so over and over, these revelations that you have over and over, the same revelations, but the most radical. Every single thing, every single concept that we have right now inside of our heads, most of them we're not even aware of, are
Right.
false notions of the self, and they trap us into something that's not actual real. What is real? I don't think anybody yet has come to that conclusion.
Hmm.
I don't think anybody has any idea of what really truly is going on. Where do we come from before birth? Where do we go after death? Those two most basic questions have never been answered.
Yeah.
Never. There's a million theories, there's a million religions, there's a million philosophies on that, but no one has that answer for sure. So I really think it's going, just the process of being. And if you want to even put psychedelics aside and say whatever techniques, whatever way that one can go back to being the way that we were as children, really before we learn language, before there were concepts for what a tree is a resource that you use for paper and tree. Before that, this tree that one
Yeah.
beholds as a little infant is not that. So it's really the process, I think, of being overall, is getting back to that open state, not hemmed in and closed in by any concepts whatsoever. And in my experience, psychedelics by far has been, without a doubt, the most radical, most powerful
Hmm.
tool for me to do that. And I could not have gotten there any other way. Even with meditation, yoga,
Right.
and all, I mean, it pries open all the ideas and the linguistically held beliefs that we all carry around, both consciously and unconsciously.
Yeah, there's a radical like disinhibition in the brain, with these substances. Again, multiple areas of the brain communicating together that don't normally communicate with each other. So again, these barriers, these things, this set and what you call like a fixed mindset is always just obliterated by that. I think so. You kind of get this whole new point of reference, where you have, okay, well, this modality of functioning is different. Same thing with the MDMA person doing, or PTSD. Someone taking MDMA, they actually get to a state of mind and a mood where, wow, this is possible. Like I can feel this way again. This is possible for my body to feel good and to, again, release these traumas and it gives people this inherent self-reference, of possible states. Again, um, when we live in routines, most of the in the West, like when we live in routines and we get up and we go to work and we do a specific task and we come home and then we have behaviors that we do. We have specific things we like. Sometimes we go to happy hour or we go, we like to watch, certain types of movies, things like that. We're stuck in a routine which we repeat and repeat and repeat, and it really limits the type of consciousness we're capable of having. You know, we've kind of lost here in the West that sense of shamanism and that sense of spiritual growth
Santa
because,
Lucis.
yeah, because we're just,
Yeah.
you know, locked in these, you know, repetitive cycles. And I think, again, those are detrimental to the spirit of people and to the nature of people. That's why you see people walking
Yeah.
around just tired
Detrimental
and,
to the being,
you
to the
know,
organism,
hmm
because we resonate with a frequency of like beautiful energy flow. There is no right, there is no wrong. We're here on this planet. It's been, I mean, what we know is 13.8 billion years of evolution, and then life itself is like around 4 billion years of
right.
evolution. We didn't do that. I mean, we were just recently on the scene. I think Homo sapiens is 200,000 years that
Yeah.
we showed up,
Modern. Yeah.
and so our natural state is radiance, and just like being inspired and like loving and open and even being able to call out bullshit. And then, again, going back to how we were when we were kids, how many times did you get in fights with your best friends and then 2 seconds later you were playing riding the bikes or whatever with them, because
Letting go
there
of
was
ego.
no concepts
Yeah.
of like, oh, I just got to fight. And so now I have to, it's just pure flow, and that is the natural state of being. But we are so cluttered with like with cultural baggage and furniture that's been placed there. And I think it's going, it's like Star Wars. It's like you must unlearn everything that you have learned to Luke, right? It really is. It's
Right.
going into unlearning all the stuff that we have learned and all the stuff that we've picked up. And
hmm
I have yet to find tools as strong and as convincing and as powerful as psychedelics. With that being said, I'm also not the one that says psychedelics is for everybody. I don't say that. I think, radically each one has to find their own path, and only you and each one knows what their own path is. But that is where everything begins. Get in touch with the self.
hmm
The self is what knows, but a lot of people, we're all fish in water. We don't even know what the water is. Someone coming up and asking the other fish, like, what do you think of this water? And you're like, what are you talking about? Until you get pulled out of the water. So it's like, and I think that in the past, that's why there's so many different techniques for what this the the main researcher on shamanism, Mircea Eliade, and he wrote Shamanism, Ancient Techniques of Ecstasy, and it's called Rupturing the Mundane Plane. And like you said, it's the sun dance, or it's
hmm
fasting, or it's whirling, or it's dancing, or it's drumming, or it's psychedelics. Whatever technique one can have to rupture that mundane plane, to kind of get outside of the perception of the ego, that seems to be really the only area, the only source of true knowledge
hmm
that's not held
Right.
in any culture, not held in any concept of man. It's outside of that, and that's the near impossible thing to even talk about it,
hmm
because it's like Alan Watts said, it's like the eyeball trying to see itself. It's
Right.
impossible what
The
we're
tooth
talking
trying to
about,
bite
and
itself.
it's only experiential. It's only experiential. It's like
hmm
going to someone who's blind and trying to tell them what it's like to see. You could spend a year side by side telling them what it's like to see outside: the trees, the breeze, the sunsets, the Grand Canyon, the morning, the sunrise, the birds. But only they can really experience that and know that if they themselves saw. And it's the same thing. And so
hmm
it's, to be a pointer to these types of experiences, but ultimately one has to let go and submit to those experiences, which, by the way, it's all going to happen eventually when we die. And that's another thing that new-ish voice, and probably one of the most important voices within psychedelics that's come about lately, is Michael Pollan,
Right.
who I've known for
How to
years
change your
because I'm in the
mind.
food industry. Yeah, How to Change Your Mind. But before that, he
hmm
wrote all stuff on food: Omnivore's Dilemma, Botany of Desire, and some of the most beautiful journalism and books about food and local food and cooking. Him coming to the psychedelic subject and having his voice in it is very important, because first of all, he's not a head that comes to it. He's a very skeptical journalist that comes to write about something, and his voice is changing the conversation and making it more accessible to the mainstream. But one thing that he said was that the psychedelic experience is dress rehearsal for death. And it's something that is so true because, again, it's that surrender.
Hmm.
At the moment of death, no matter, no, if we all have the privilege of laying on the deathbed and watching it come, and so we have time to process, we have time to say goodbye to all of our loved ones and everything that we know. No matter what, the only thing that one can do is to surrender deeper and deeper and deeper to the great unknown, because it is the great unknown. Not one of us knows what's on the other side, you know? And
Right.
so the psychedelics is the same exact thing as going in, and that is the importance of who you're doing it with, the set and the setting.
Yeah.
When you're doing it, it's an intentional place. It's somewhat a ritual place, and you do it with that intention. And so, as things unfold, you feel comfortable to fully surrender and get beyond all the resistances and the fears that are built into the organism, because it just is. Just like, no one's going to approach death and be like, okay, yes, let's get it on. Okay, no one,
Hmm.
no matter what, how bravado one is or not. And so I see psychedelics as great practice for that. And I
Yeah.
mean, and I always remember the Buddhist saying, all life, all life, every second of every day is nothing but practice for death. And when I heard that, I was just like, holy, it's like, how far off is it of how we all spend our day in and day out? If they go in through every day,
Hmm.
spending it practicing for death. And so I see psychedelics as also tools for that, of the great release at the very end, which none of us here get out alive.
Yeah. I
So
mean, it's
it will help for
interesting
that moment in time.
what happens to the art of living, for example, when you do actually think about death, like how much more, you hear about people who have near death experiences, how much more like love they have in this life. It's like, wow, it's just such the biggest reality check I think you can have, in terms of like how you live your life and where you end up going. People are filled with so much more peace and so much serenity and awe, and they let go of the little things too. I mean, near death experiences, those sorts of things. And one of the big things in the research now too is about DMT, and how DMT is actually released in the brain around the time of death. And what is that, right? Because again, in the scientific sense, you'd be like, well, what mechanism does that play? What purpose does that play in the biology? Like, why does the brain do this? Is that to ease the blow, or it's for some people say it's for this kind of higher dimensional awareness which comes in at the point of the we could say the subjectivity, the soul leaving the corpse, right, the body, and this whole idea of what happens. But again, getting down to that deeper nature of reality, I think, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, you were talking about that, how we get to deeper levels of just understanding what this play is, right? Because we take the Shakespearean aspect here. All the world is a stage, and we are merely players. Taking perspectives, holding perspectives. Again, getting out of that framing with psychedelics, we come back to that childlike state, eliminate these resistances and these grudges, the emotional baggage you were mentioning. As adults, we really do carry so much. We have this narrative and we have this story, and I can only do what fits the narrative. And if we have a trajectory in life, we can only turn left or right, right? We can't hop to other timelines and things like that. And I think that's something that, again, these substances allow the individual to do, is really just hop to completely different modes of being instantaneously. Huge revolutions in the mind and in the self. And again, what that means for the nature of reality, if such a small substance can really fundamentally completely overhaul the way we perceive, it becomes really, really interesting as to, okay, well, what is reality in its essence, right? If we can see other layers of reality just by modulating a little bit of the chemistry that we're experiencing, what is that deeper and truer nature of how we interface with reality? We've been holding these states of
100%.
mind for however long. And again, if whether or not it's a guiding hand in our evolution, definitely in the evolution of self in the individual, right? Revelations in the individual, and then how does that pass to the culture, right? Especially if we have this in our evolutionary past. You look at witches brewing, old brews, right? Brewing things, shamans, everything going back into history. There's always been that experimentation of self, and it's been incredibly powerful and ceremonial and ritualistic and pertinent to our growth. And it's really weird, again, getting past that societal nature, right? To get past these stigmas and why even those stigmas exist, right? Are they for a means to an end, to limit, I guess, anti-authoritarianism, and really, again, come into collective culture, come into those things. But really interesting. So, as far as McKenna Academy, I want to say that across. What's coming
McKenna,
up?
we kind of went far and wide. So
Yeah. So,
yeah,
what's
getting
coming
back,
up
I
for
guess.
you guys soon? What are some of the
Well,
events
one,
and?
the big project that we have right now is called Biognosis, and there is a partnership that we have with the university. It's called UNAP down in Iquitos, Peru, and there's a gentleman there. His name is Juan Ruiz, and he's known Dennis since the early '70s, and he's in charge of this herbarium, a collection of 150,000 plant specimens
Wow.
that have been collected since all the way back to 1950s. And essentially, 100,000 of these plant specimens are in between paper that are basically in one room at this university, and there's another 50,000 that have to be mounted. And so, what we're trying to do with that is to digitize the herbarium so the knowledge cannot be lost if an accident, a fire, time.
Right.
And so, right now we have one short documentary that we've produced, and with the plans of going producing another 5 to 7 more to raise awareness and to raise money for this project called Biognosis. And it's online on the McKenna Academy website. It's available for everyone
Cool.
to check out. I could send you the link also if you want to put that in the notes after the show.
100%.
But this is the big project that we're working on right now. And again, it's McKenna Academy is in its kind of its infancy, right? To try to raise money for this one project. There's a lot of other projects that we talk about when we gather, and just for me, it's really, and I say this when we talk in the board meetings is, and we didn't have time. I have to get off in 5 minutes. But what brought me around to this what brought me to this is Dennis, and Dennis
Hmm.
I've known since the late '90s, and Dennis is the only person that I know that has undergone the shamanic experience, and his quest that took him down to the Amazon in the '70s in search of these realities and these substances and psilocybin and then ayahuasca. It's just I really feel that today what is needed are our elders. We have no elders. I mean,
Right.
again, not to bash the West. I mean, I'm very thankful to be in Washington D.C. where we live right now and everything that we have. But it's like, but our leaders and our elders today in the West are their own Capitol Hill, 10 minutes away from where I'm at right now. They're in the Catholic Church. They're in the leaders of corporations. Those are our elders. Those are our leaders right now. And if you really look into who they are and the example that they set, I mean, it's not one that I would follow. So
Hmm.
it's like really in this moment in time, I mean, we need to empower ourselves so we know what's wisdom and what's not. But beyond that, we need examples of what are we here for? What's the way to be in this world? What is important? And so that's really for the last 20 plus years
Yeah.
with Dennis. That's why when he asked me if I wanted to be a part of the academy and be on the board, I immediately said yes, just because of the type of person that he is, and just his heart. He's a child. He's a
Yeah.
brilliant, brilliant child that has a beautiful heart, but has also really looked probably deeper into the matter of self and being and reality than most people that I've met. So
Yeah.
Biognosis, that's it's a
Right.
project that's really amazing and a very big ambitious project that we're moving
Amazing.
forward with right
Just
now.
scratching the surface here of some of these
Oh,
things, even the
there's so many
psychedelics and all these
conversations
things.
that we could go deep and
Yeah.
wide with.
So, Mr. Robb Duncan, thank you for having being on the show. Thank you for being a part of this. Anyone who's watching, you guys can check out McKenna Academy. We'll have links in the description, so check that out. Look into Biognosis and all these things soon, and maybe we'll have you on the show again soon, Rob.
I would love to come back
Cool.
anytime, Daniel. Thanks for
Cool.
having me, man.
All right,
Have a good
guys.
rest of your day.
Conscious Endeavor out.